All right. Okay, so we're talking about the oil pressure relief valve. Let's see if it sticks open. Engine will not have oil pressure. We talked about that. Relief is located between pressure pump and internal system. We already know that. We know the relief is a ball or a valve that sits on a seat. Tell me if I should write in this. Spring pressure keeps the valve closed until pressure overcomes the spring and unseats the valve, right? We know that?
Yep.
Okay. Oil pressure is initially set up where?
During overhaul.
We're supposed to be high.
Overall at the bench.
Yes. Initially set at the overhaul shop. Then adjusted on a hot engine. In theory, if you're actually breaking in an engine on a test stand, it'll reach a proper operating temperature, but you still want to do it when it gets to the aircraft.
Are we going to be able to do that on ours?
Yeah. Sucks. You got to unscrew it. It leaks oil everywhere and add washers. Let's see. When cold, oil pressure may be what? High or low?
Look,
High. Cold engine, high oil pressure. As engine wears, what's going to happen to that bypass valve?
It's going to wear out.
It's going to open less and less and less and less. Until eventually it's just closed and the pump's doing the best that it can. Okay, so at idle, how much oil is probably going through the oil pressure relief valve on a hot engine?
A little bit. Engine got old, hot pressure, probably a lot.
Very little.
You're saying
When
I've just finished a flight. I've landed. I pulled my engine back to idle. How much is that oil pressure relief valve going to be open?
yeah.
very little.
None at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be closed. Absolutely closed. All right, we go through the whole flight. Get in the aircraft. It's cold. And cold could be just, middle of the summer around here, 70, 80 degrees, but the engine's not going to be that. So I start up the engine at idle. What's my pressure going to be? High, probably top of the green.
For idle, yeah.
Really high. How much is the relief valve open?
all the way.
Well, it's all the way. It's going to be open some, right?
Be open enough.
Yep. And then oil warms up a little bit. I'm going to see the oil pressure maybe drop a little bit. Maybe not. Take the runway. Add full power. Now what? It's going to open up even more.
Yeah,
But my pressure is going to be at?
Oh, so you're saying constant displacement.
No, because it's displacing more faster.
We'll just use real numbers. So, all right, I get in my airplane. It's cold. I start it up. I'm at idle, and I see 60 psi. Cold at idle.
Your valve's open.
It's probably open. All right, wait a little bit, do my run up. Oil gets to 100 degrees. I'm at idle. I look over, and my oil pressure's 60.
It's open.
It's still open. All right, so I do my run up, take the center line, full power. Whoosh. Now what's a relief valve going to do?
60.
60, what's a relief valve doing?
All the way.
It's going to open up even more because now the pump is going faster. It's constant displacement, so it's displacing more oil into the engine. So that relief valve's got to open wider to keep the pressure at 60. Right? Then I'm flying along. Oil, goes from 100 to 180. What's that relief valve start doing? Start closing, right? The engine's going to start expanding. Space gets expanded. The oil pump cavity is expanded. Everything gets worse. And so that pressure relief valve is going to start closing more and more and more. All right. So time goes on. The engine's wearing out. And I'm in flight. Oil relief used to be open yay much. Now it's going to be probably closed all the way. Maybe, right? And oil pressure will be a little less than 60 now. All right. Land the airplane, pull it back to idle. What am I going to see for? Now I got really hot oil. Land the airplane, pull it back to idle. What am I going to see for pressures? Probably about 10. That's about it. So it drops way down on a hot engine. And the relief valve is all the way closed because I don't have 60. All right. All right, I told you how to adjust it. You either have a screw or add washers.
Can the pilot adjust the oil pressure, or is that only an AMP can do that?
I don't think that's under preventative maintenance. Should be, but I don't know if it is. Let's see, troubleshooting. If an oil gauge is installed at the pump outlet and at the end of the last gallery. Okay, so I'm concerned about oil pump or wear in the engine. So oil pressure at pump outlet versus oil pressure at end of gallery. So you know those pipe plugs that you put in your engine on the front of the engine? There's only one up there on the front.
Yeah.
Okay, let's say you put a gauge right there at that one, and you got a gauge where it's supposed to be out of the back of the accessory case. I forgot to have an accessory case sitting right here. Right there's where it comes out of. So if you put a gauge right here, which you should, that's where it's normally taken, and you put one all the way in the front of the engine. It's the other side, I'd have to dig it out. Is it right there? Right there at that plug, you should get about 10 psi difference. According to Lycoming.
Brand new. Or just overall?
Overall. So, let's see. If you have greater than 10 psi difference, what is your problem?
They're a little worn out.
You have some sort of open, something worn out. So, could be bearing wear. Could have a relief problem. Relief stuck, open, something like that. If it is less than 10 psi, you have blockage. Oil's not getting out and going to the engine. It's just going through the gap and getting to the gauge down at the end. That's not a bad thing. All right, something else you need to know about. A compensating oil pressure relief valve.
You drive a Hummer?
Do I drive a Hummer?
No, does the
Compensating oil pressure. It's compensating.
Okay. I got it. Sometimes it's best just to ignore it. All right, so we talked about the little problem there in our scenario where you start up a cold engine and it pegs itself out. And then as you start flying, it's going to work its way down, down, and down, and down. Well, if you've got a really large radial engine and you need a little bit more pressure to move this very cold oil into the bearings because it uses thicker oil, then it's not really that cool that this cold engine is being bypassed at 60 psi. So you could possibly imagine a scenario whereby you start your engine and it's so cold that the bypass is the easiest way for it to go. So it goes out of the oil pump over to the bypass and down. And how much goes to the engine? Little or nothing. And it just fills up the galleries and it's not enough to push it into the bearings. So you have this problem. Well, okay, so then I'm going to just crank it all the way up until I start it and I get 120 psi. Well, now I got to fly around at 120 psi all the time, and that's too much. So they make a thing is called a compensating oil pressure relief. So many large aircraft reciprocating engines have a compensating oil pressure relief valve that allows the oil pressure for cold oil to be considerably higher than it is for warm oil. So allows cold oil pressure to be higher than warm oil pressure. The higher pressure allows thicker, higher viscosity oil to be forced through the engine bearings. The plunger of the oil pressure relief valve is held down by two springs when the oil is cold. However, when the oil warms up, a thermostatic valve opens and allows oil pressure to remove the force of one of the springs. For normal operation, only one spring holds the pressure on the seat. So you would have something similar to this, the Vernotherm, where this one expands when it is hot and shrinks when it's cold. So you just set something up so it works the other way. So when something is cold, it'll put pressure on this spring, and as it heats up, it'll relieve the pressure on the auxiliary spring, allowing only one to work. So that ends up being 2 springs when cold, 1 spring when hot. Is that okay that I abbreviated that much? All right. I did just throw this in my notes. I think you'll talk about this more possibly with Phil or Larry. Oil separator. And that used on wet type vacuum pumps. So most airplanes, you're going to see fewer and fewer of them, have a vacuum pump. Like I took the one off my airplane off. Don't use it anymore because your instruments are pressure operated, but we don't blow at them, we suck at them. So use a vacuum pump that draws a vacuum, and you hook up that vacuum to the instrument in one hole, and then there's a filter going into the instrument through and then down to the vacuum pump. So the vacuum pump is blowing air this way, sucking it through a filter, through the instrument, and then out. And the reason why we do it that way is because vacuum pumps tend to explode when they're done. They run until they're done, and then they just explode inside. They just kind of, not externally, but internally, they just die. All the pieces explode inside of it, and then they're done. So if you did that, it would then blow all of the bad parts into your very expensive instruments. So this way it just blows a little bit of pieces overboard, and then your instruments die because there's no vacuum. Well, there's dry types, which most aircraft have, and wet types. And the wet types, you have to separate out the oil and the air. You don't want to keep blowing oil overboard. So there's an air-oil separator that takes that air, separates it out, takes the oil, and puts it back into the crankcase. So that's just an oil separator. But you're seeing fewer and fewer vacuum pumps as we go to digital instrumentation. Oil coolers again. All right, so oil coolers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Quick question on that. Why not manifold vacuum? Why a vacuum pump?
This would just be my opinion. So I'm flying along in instrument conditions, and my life depends upon the instruments. And now I've got an engine failure. So I now have no instruments and no engine.
That
But
wouldn't
he
a
would-
vacuum pump
yeah.
do?
Huh?
Doesn't the vacuum pump run off the engine?
Didn't think about that.
Would that
Huh.
change, would changing manifold pressure change the vacuum then? Whereas maybe a vacuum pump could remain more constant?
Yeah, it would be.
Yeah, that is definitely true, because you're going to get way more vacuum at idle. Not so much. I don't know.
Better source of the vacuum.
Yeah.
Is that what the little Venturis are sometimes on the side?
That's exactly what they are. So instead of having a vacuum pump, you have the Venturis. Like your engine. You don't have a vacuum pump, you drive on your engine. So there's no vacuum pump drives until you get to the 0200. That's the first model that has a vacuum pump. So you put the Venturi on the outside. So you have no instruments until you get flying. You just kind of lay there, kind of sideways. You probably don't even have an artificial horizon, do you?
I just put one in.
Huh.
You don't have to worry
Why do you need
about
an
engine
artificial
failure.
horizon? There's always one like right there.
That's right outside the window. All right, so oil coolers. So many, but not all. Many engines use an oil cooler. All right, so Lycoming tends to use remotes, and I think by tens I mean always. Lycoming uses remote coolers. By remote, I mean it's mounted somewhere near the engine, sometimes even on the engine, but there are hoses going from the engine to the cooler and then back from the cooler. Continental tends to use, unless it's the very small engines, which don't normally have oil coolers anyway, they tend to mount the coolers right to the crankcase with no hoses whatsoever. So TCM for Continental uses engine-mounted coolers, which means no hoses, which is a good thing.
Like a soft light
No hoses, period. No hard lines, no nothing. It's just bolted right to the engine. The passages are drilled into the crankcase. The passages are drilled into the oil cooler. You mount the two together with a gasket, and there you go. So,
Like the pump, but a cooler.
sure.
The way the hole is going.
Yep.
Yeah, like an alternator.
And like we talked about the other day, an oil cooler is just a small radiator. So an oil cooler is a small radiator. They have very small passages through them that oil has to flow through. If your oil pressure is too high, that's the answer. It will blow apart your oil cooler.
Okay. Ah.
Yeah.
Oh, those things can't handle a lot, huh?
No. Yeah, small passages. Through cooling fins.
Do they give you a rating on those things, what they're good for?
I don't think so.
Just gotta figure it out.
Cooling fins that dissipate heat. That dissipates heat, well, 2 atmosphere. These small openings or small passages can collect debris. I know I worked with one guy who, you'd have an engine with some sort of contamination, and it's like, well, where do you think the contamination goes? It goes in the filter, and then it goes in the oil cooler where it sticks in there. So he took it to our safety clean tank, and he just hooks one hose in the inlet and sticks it in the safety clean tank and turns it on, and he'll run it for a whole day. So what did that accomplish?
Back flush it out.
Yeah, try and back flush it out.
When he rusted it, or it's aluminum.
It's aluminum, and we use solvent and not this. So what did that accomplish?
Got everything out, but it didn't fix the problem.
Well, if you have one passage that was completely plugged, it stayed plugged because there's not enough pressure. But if you had any metal contaminants in the safety clean tank, it did a very nice job of filtering them out too. So it made our safety clean tank a lot cleaner. And where did that stuff go? Into the cooler. So radiators, oil coolers, anything, if you actually want to clean them, you have to desolder or take the tanks off of it and they use brushes and go through every single little passage. That's how they clean them, or ultrasonic or something. So you can't field clean these things. If you suspect that you have a contamination problem, you send them out and have them professionally flushed.
Well, that's why you have a high idle pressure, so that
Yeah,
pressure
yeah,
washes
yeah,
every
yeah.
time.
Let's see.
Also, that seems like it's not really solving a problem. It's like you still have particles in the engine. You know what I mean? It's like,
Well, the engine was being overhauled,
Oh.
so it's
So you have a bunch of those on hand, so you just repair and replace and kick the other one out to a shop to repair it.
hard to keep a extra oil cooler for every conceivable engine around. Some coolers have an inner core and outer core. So it says 2 cores. So very cold oil bypasses the cooler. We don't want that. I say, well, gosh, I think it's your Q&A, and one of the answers is surge. That means the surge valve
Oh, yeah.
closed. Oops, I didn't want that to do that. Surge valve closed. Surge valve closed. That says closed. Surge valve closed. Surge valve directs cold oil around the core. So not through the core, but around the core. Core is the middle, where all those little fine see. I had some pictures like oil coolers in here. There you go, doo-doo, oil cooler. So you have the tanks on the side, even though it's a terrible picture. And here's the core. See these little cores right here. So the surge valve, and this type engine is not going to have a surge valve to it. But, so not all engines are going to have this surge valve. It's just bigger oil coolers with the inner and outer cores that use it. So this surge valve will make the oil go around the outside and back through and not through the middle, is what it's saying. Bad picture for this, but hopefully.
That's not the same thing as a flow control valve?
Nope, totally different. So the flow control valve, or the vernotherm as I call them, or Lycoming calls them, which, you know, I keep losing the one up because it's right here. This is different. So this is on the engine side, and this either directs oil to the cooler or to the engine. Remember? So if it's open, it says to the oil, go which way you would like. I don't care. So some of the oil is going to go towards the oil cooler with its very tiny passages, and most of it's going to go to the engine with its much bigger passages. But then as this heats up, it's going to block off the path to the engine, so the oil has to go to the cooler. So surge valve, so then I've never worked on this particular type of oil cooler system. It's not in any of the engines that I work on or have ever worked on. I imagine it's probably something old that was in a radial engine, to be honest with you. So surge valve directs cold oil around the core through an annular jacket. So when I think about what that means, it's annular, meaning a ring. It's going to go around the oil cooler. So it's like I'm forcing the oil to go through the oil cooler, much like take the Bonanza system we looked at. Right, where the oil had to come back and it had to go through the cooler. There's only one path right here. So it goes engine, scavenge pump, cooler. What if I don't want it to be cooled? Right, I can't use this because this directs oil engine or cooler. Well, this has one choice. It's got to go through the cooler. So we can put this system on it where it gets to the cooler. Then we can have this valve that says, okay, congratulations, you made it to the cooler. I got no choice but to let you come through. So the choices are around the fins or through the fins. Through the fins means the oil is going to get colder. So you don't want cold oil getting colder. So this valve is going to make it go around and down in.
So would you ever have a vernotherm and a surge valve in the same system, right?
I don't think you would.
It wouldn't make
Because where would you put a vernotherm in that system? It's like it wouldn't make any sense. Let me see. Annular jacket. But this also, this warms the oil in the core, which is kind of nice. So that oil that's in the core, which is getting heat or cold air already on it, this does help warm that oil. And then once the oil gets hot, hot oil is directed through the fins or through the core. Core output / cooling fins. So on other engines, not this one, but on other engines, oil that may be controlled by a thermal control valve. Which is what I have here. So, AKA, also known as vernotherm. Vernotherm, thermostatic control. Valve, or oil cooler bypass valve. And as we already talked about with this one, I'll make that I, 1, 2, valve, let me see. How about this cold valve? Opens passages to engine and cooler. Most oil bypasses cooler, right? And then a hot valve closes off passage to engine forcing oil into cooler. And then I told you yesterday about the fact that where this thing sits in some Lycomings with the adapter is like right about here. And the part of, and oh yeah, there's also, some of them sit kind of this way too. It's a different looking screen housing. So you can put it this way and it goes through a different adapter. But anyway, the oil temp is right there too. And so you can get some leakage past this thing onto your oil temp bulb, which will give you a false indication of oil temp being higher than it really is, just because of the weird design of it, but that's not worth worrying about. Something to keep in your mind if you ever work on them. Okay, so some aircraft use a float, and I don't even know what this is, a floating control thermostat, floating. To control airflow through the cooler. To control airflow through cooler. We were talking the other day with the second year, Larry came down here, and there's some weird thing in your textbook that says one very common way of controlling the air, it is some sort of weird thing that neither Larry or I had ever heard of and never seen. And what it talks about is some sort of control valve that is a flapper valve that actually controls the amount of air that can go through the cooler. So if the oil is getting too cold, it just closes off the door that keeps the air from even getting to the cooler, and then it would open this door back up. Well, we've done a bunch of research, and the only planes that there was 2 planes they could come up with that had it. One was an RV, which is a home built, and I forget the other one. It's like a particular model of Mooney or something like that. So just be aware that is possible.
Sounds like something you would really only want in like Midwest to the East Coast.
Yeah. All right, we already talked about the oil is cooled before or after it goes to the engine.
Cooled?
I guess it depends on where your starting point was. You cool it, then pump it to the engine, then go through the engine. There you go. So it
It's
goes.
gonna heat up in the engine, you wanna cool it down after.
There you go. So it's after.
Sorry, what is it? It says something and then use a floating.
Some aircraft use a floating control thermostat to control airflow through the cooler. All right, already wrote this. So a dry sump. Dry sump engine goes tank. What's next? Pump, not scavenge pump. Tank, pressure pump,
Pump filter.
filter, engine,
And, or the valve, first the pressure relief valve,
pressure relief valve, engine,
engine, scavenge pump,
scavenge pump, cooler, tank.
Overflow.
Wet sump would be oil pump,
Filter.
Pressure relief valve.
pressure relief valve, then filter.
No.
Oil pressure relief valve.
Filter then in.
Or
Well, ours is filtered first.
Yeah, ours is filtered in oil pressure relief valve.
Where? I don't even have that on here. Oil pump, bypass. I didn't put this in. I was more worried about cooler, where the cooler is. Let's pull it up.
I was gonna say in the diagram it goes with
There you go.
stuff.
Oil pump,
Bypass
And
valve.
then
bypass, oil cooler, then
Pressure screen.
into the engine. So this is kind of weird. It's a little bit different. It doesn't leave the engine, go to an oil cooler and come back in, because the oil cooler is after the oil pump. So it's got to cool it before it goes in the engine, which is what we said before. So in the dry sump, it's going to leave the engine, go to a cooler, drop into the tank. On yours, it is going to go oil pump,
cooler, then
cooler, then engine. And this one's got it cooler, then pressure screen, then off into it. Follow? All right. Does this have similar to my engine? So my cooler's up over here. So it'll be pump, oil gallery, cooler. Yeah, it's kind of weird. Okay. Oil temp is taken
Right before you enter the engine.
before we go to the engine. And the engine adds about
50 degrees.
50 degrees. Okay. I already talked about the oil pressure gauge. Had talked about the small orifice. Remember that? All right. Talk a little about pre-oiling. So on a new engine, or I think an engine that had been sitting for a very long time, you want to pre-oil it. So there's a couple ways you can go about pre-oiling. So pre-oiling. I want to do that to either a new engine or fresh overhaul, or one that maybe has gone through major repair, prop strike, which is same disassembly, reassemble. So there's really two ways to do it. One, you can use a pressure pot. So what you do is you take out all of the spark plugs and you open up this guy. I like to do it right up the front where that little plug is. You lied to me. You said, oh, there it is. Okay, open up that little plug right there. And I'm going to hook a pressure pot to this. And you do a lot of different things with the pressure pot. You know, you can just take a can that's got, say that holds 6 quarts of oil. Put 6 quarts of oil in a can, and maybe you just have a pump that pumps into the engine, right? It'll pump it in that way backwards, going through the galleries, working its way down the oil pump and go backwards. I had a pot that I really liked that had, you'd open the top, you pour in 4 to 8 quarts of oil, seal the top back up. It had a little thing, a Schrader valve, like filling your car tires, right? I would fill that up to about 100 PSI on this little gauge. And then the tank, and out the bottom, it had a little valve and a hose that came out. And so I'd pressurize it to 110, open up the valve, 100 PSI goes through that little line, goes into the engine. You can go into the cockpit and look at the little oil pressure gauge, climb up to about 100 PSI. So I'd use the pressure pot. I like to do both. I'd use the pressure pot and then motor the engine. So with the spark plugs out, so you have no pressure on the engine whatsoever, and no chance of it starting, hit the starter and motor it through. And again, you'll watch the oil pressure just start to climb. So if you can do both, that's great. If you can only do one because you don't have the pressure pot, then motor the engine. What I'm going to have you guys do is, I can't remember my pressure pot situation, but if we have a pressure pot that's working, I'll have you do that. And then You will not use the key in the starter because we've had problems with students building bad engines who would sit there with the key in the starter until the starter smoked, and they're $500-600 and only have one left. So once that starter's done, we're done running engines. So you can only use the starter for, I'll give you like, even when you go to start your engine, I'm going to give you just a few seconds of starter use. If your engine doesn't start after a few seconds, you're done, you troubleshoot. So, but you'll just go on the front and you'll just turn it over by hand. You can turn it just as fast with the spark plugs out as the starter can do it, pretty much, very close to it. So you'll just move, and I'll help you do that because that's fun to sit there and watch it, get the oil pressure coming up. So we're going to pre-oil it. All right, then we can talk about cooling. Which is kind of where I need to end this whole thing. Engine cooling. What do I have to say about cooling? A lot to say about cooling. Cooling is one of those things that people take for granted. It's like, oh, I didn't talk about that. All right. Before we talk about cooling, I'll throw in the aerobatic system here. Do I have the other one? So there were two types of aerobatic engines Lycoming produced. The AEIO series, aerobatic engine injected opposed, and the AIO, aerobatic injected opposed. There's the AE and the A. And if I got it right, I've never seen an AE. They're a very weird crankcase that has a sump built into the top of the case and a bolt-on the bottom. So you have double sumps. And like I said, I've never even seen one. I don't think Lycoming produces them anymore. I don't even know if...
Is that experimental?
Oh, no, it's a certified engine. They just stopped making them. Let's see if we can... Yeah, I don't see one. I've only seen drawings of them.
Does it even
Like a
exist?
unicorn, huh?
Yeah, is it just in your
It's a
mind?
mythical engine.
No, it did exist.
You sure it wasn't just a dream?
Good for sailors.
What's that?
Yeah.
Nope. Yeah,
You got it. You ain't selling it.
I don't see it. So anyway, but then there's the other one, the AIOs, if I have that right. What did I want? This over here. And this is what you will find on the now aerobatic engines, is the Kristen inverted system. It's what they all use. So you go to any fully aerobatic aircraft, it's going to have the Kristen system in it. And you can tell them because it has, number one, this white ball check valve there, and the big oil separator right there. So that's how you can identify them. And so the way it works is in normal flight, this ball check thing right here that I mentioned, this right here is right over here. And then the oil separator is over here, the big white thing right there. So in normal flight, you want it to act like a normal engine, right? So we should be sucking it up from the oil sump up through the gears and then into the engine. And then blow-by gases would just blow out that way. Well, it's a little bit different. So right now we've got two pickup tubes. So with in normal 1G flight, these balls are going to fall down. Take a seat, right? This one falls down, does nothing. This one falls down, take a seat. So oil is sucked, so we have pressure holding this ball down through here, around, and up into the engine. Gases go through here and overboard because this ball is down on its little seat. Follow?
No.
So it's just no big deal. Now we go upside down to fly, and the ball falls the other way. Boom, boom. So now this one is held by gravity here because we're flying around upside down. All the oil fell to this side of the crankcase. And so that breather now becomes the suction. So this slid this way, blocks that off. And so instead of letting the oil come out overboard, it blocks it off. Oil comes up through here, through this check ball, over into the gears, lubricates the engine and drops down here. Blow-by gases, by the way, go this way, around, through this ball check valve that is now open. So That's the Kristen system. Easy peasy?
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess you just kind of lose all your oil if you just sat on a knife edge the whole time.
Yeah, if you float around like this, you never know what you're going to get, so gotta be careful with that.
Yeah.
So, all right, we're going to talk about, Larry's going to talk, Larry talked about that. Where's the bypass in these? Solder joint, okay. So Larry's going to talk all about those. We already talked about the Blackstone report. Cylinder head temp probes. I talked about cylinder head temp probes where there's a little hole in the cylinders. That's a bayonet style. I think it screws up in there. And this is, if you don't have the hole, then you can use a spark plug style right there. So I want to come back and talk about that a little bit.
Do you replace those every time you?
Nope. Yeah, you never replace them. So, right, that's the joke. If you have a spark, you change the spark plug, you always do what? Change the washer. It's very, very important that you change the washer. Unless you have this style of spark plug temperature gauge, then you
Keep it forever.
keep it forever. It's fine. Don't worry about it.
So if
Does
I
it have a second?
can I just put some wires to my washer and say it's
Yeah, well, you're going to learn all about thermocouple wires with Phil
lasts forever.
and how they work. But it's just, dissimilar metal creates a micro voltage with heat that's picked up. It's all right. So how do our engines, how are they cooled? Well, they are air cooled. And it depends upon a pressure cowling. And it's the difference in air pressure. They'll sometimes call it a delta P, which stands for change in pressure between up here, which is a pressure cowling. It is a low velocity, high pressure air. Comes through here, and down here is a higher velocity, low pressure air. So in a sense, it sucks down here the air coming through the cowling. So believe it or not, the spinner, this thing right here, is part of the cooling system. You can't just decide one day to fly around without the spinner. That's part of the cooling system. It's got to be there. When you are just running up your engine on the ground, this propeller, you can see, does not provide a whole lot of thrust inside of there. So your cooling is dependent upon forward movement, not just sitting there. The other thing I'll throw out at you is a lot of people like to run engines without the cowling. Well, that means the air comes along here and just swirls over the top and away it goes. It does not cool the engine whatsoever. You will get a very hot running engine, so you don't want to do that very long. I baked a set of 520s, man. I cooked them damn good one time. Wasn't my choice. I complained. I was supposed to set up the fuel flows on them, and it was like 110 degrees out. And I'm like, this is not good for those engines. And like, we need to get it done. And I'm like, yeah, well, I don't want to do it. And they're like, well, you're going to do it anyway. So there it was, 110 degrees, running these things at wide open freaking throttle, adjusting fuel flows for 4 hours. And it was like, it was a brand new airplane too. Anyway, that's what happens when you get a manager who's not a AMP. Okay, so tomorrow we'll talk all about the cooling and baffle systems and cowl flaps and all kinds of stuff. So it's baffling, isn't it?
Yeah.